as they mentioned, I'm going to talk to you today about presenting effectively at mixed mode or hybrid events, which is something we have to do more and more often these days, but is incredibly challenging. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land that I'm speaking to you from today, and that's the Wurundjeri people. And I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present, and to extend that respect to any Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander people here today. So before I get started on the main content, just a little bit of housekeeping, which I feel we're all kind of used to by this point with all of our online presentations. But if I could just ask you to generally keep your microphone off during the presentation, although, I mean, I do like some banter, and please do feel free to turn the microphone on if you can't hear me or see my slides. If you've got any questions as we go through, I am going to be stopping throughout the presentation so that you can ask questions at key points. But also please feel free while they're in your head to type them into the chat box, and we'll monitor them as we go. And also please leave your video on or off as you prefer. It's always really difficult to feel engaged in this kind of format, so it can be helpful to have at least one or two of you, which I certainly do have at the moment, with your cameras on, so that I feel like I have someone I'm speaking to. So to start with, I just want to flag that what this presentation is and what this presentation is not. So I'm not going to give too much in the way of general presentation skills, although some of those will come through the tips that I'm providing. This is really focused more on the things that I have learned and the sort of skills I've developed through this type of presentation or through the mixed mode presentations. I am, of course, happy to answer questions on general presentations, but there are a lot of different opportunities that people have to get general presentation skills, and I think this is just to give you an idea of how to present in this hybrid setting. So presentations are one of these things that can fill people with the fear, and irrespective of what method you're using, whether it's online or in person, it's something that can be incredibly daunting. And unfortunately, as statisticians, we're often not provided with much guidance on how to present. As I say, some of you who may be PhD students or master students, perhaps your institution has given you some guidance. But generally speaking, you have to go a bit outside your workplace or outside of your traditional training to find this kind of training in presentation skills. And it's really hard to develop without actually just going out and practicing, to be honest, in some ways. So where did I start? Where did my experience come from? So I find presentations very, very challenging, very stressful, and I have to say I was really thrown in at the deep end with presentations when I was an early career statistician. So throughout I did an undergraduate in statistics and an honours in statistics, and my first ever oral presentation wasn't until my honours year, and I was absolutely petrified. Have to mention though, the picture on this slide is not from that presentation. That would have been an incredibly daunting honours presentation. But I'd gone from speaking in a room for my honours for 20 people to my very, very first presentation as a PhD student was at an international conference in Reykjavik in Iceland. And I was really thrown into the deep end there. So this was an international conference for medical researchers and biologists. And I was just about to leave. My PhD supervisor knew that I was quite terrified of this presentation. And he let me know, oh, Karen, great, best ever attendance of a conference of this type. We've now got 1,000 delegates signed up to attend. So I'm like, oh, great. That's slightly nerve-wracking, but sure, I'll give it a go. Oh, another thing you should know, Karen, is that there are no parallel sessions. Everyone speaks to everyone. So when you are presenting, you're going to be up there in the main conference room speaking to a large audience. But don't worry, they can only fit 600 people in that room. So you're going to be videoed into 2 other rooms with the rest of the delegates. So yeah, way to get me started in my presentation journey. And look, I have to admit, I was presenting the day after the conference dinner, so I didn't quite have the full 1,000 people, but I still had quite a large audience, which was quite stressful for me. And look, I have to say, one of the things I learned quite quickly was, okay, people were a little bit tired post the conference dinner. But yeah, not everyone was quite as engaged as I wanted them to be at this presentation. As you can see from this person that I have highlighted here, she really did not seem so impressed about me talking about mathematical modelling. So what did I learn? Well, for one thing, for me, given I was incredibly nervous about it all, I learned that I could actually survive delivering a presentation to 1,000 people. Another important thing that I learned was that experienced researchers and presenters can be every bit as nervous as you are. So actually, the other thing that was incredibly terrifying about this presentation was I was speaking immediately after their keynote. And this was someone from Harvard whose work I had brought into my own PhD. I was referencing throughout mine. So that added to the level of stress. But before our presentation, he was sitting next to me, really, really lovely guy, introduced himself before he started. But he was sitting with his knee shaking, his foot moving the whole time, and he was clearly absolutely terrified to go and present, and then gave the most beautiful presentation once he got up to the lectern. So I have to admit that was quite helpful for me because I was really nervous, but I certainly wasn't visibly quite as nervous as he was. But then once he got up to present, you had no idea. But I think it's important to recognise that this is something that's daunting for everyone, regardless of how experienced you are. It's always hard to get up there to put yourself out there and speak about your work. And of course, the other thing is preparation is key, and it can help you get over your nerves. Now, this presentation was challenging for me, like many of you that are going to be speaking at the Early Career Conference, because my talk was only about 5 or 6 minutes. So it was really important to practice and practice a lot to make sure I got my messages as concisely as possible and made sure that I didn't run over time in this sort of tightly scheduled conference. So one of the things I learned that were bad, as I say, I wasn't particularly experienced. I didn't really know what I was doing, and I was quite terrified. But I mean, I showed you that picture of that person phasing out. I kind of realised that I should think more about my audience. In retrospect, I probably had a bit more mathematics on my slides than I really should have had. And I wish I'd thought more about the key messages that I wanted these clinicians and biological and medical researchers to get out, rather than showing them equations. That really was not the best approach to get my message across. Other thing that you might discover here, and as I say, please feel free to drop me a line if you're struggling with this accent, but I do have a very strong Scottish accent and a tendency to be overexcitable. That was challenging delivering presentations in person. But now when I find myself as just like a talking head in this kind of format, I can't read the room and I can't read off of all of you to see if you are understanding me. And that can make things quite tricky. So I always have to have it in the back of my mind that this is a challenge people might be faced when listening to me. Another thing, of course, is presenting is exhausting. Irrespective of how you deliver your presentation, it is very, very tiring. And actually, I was fortunate that at this particular conference, my PhD supervisor allowed me to just go and hide for a bit, and he fielded questions after the event. But now it's much more common, of course, if you're presenting in person, people want to come and chat to you, they want to chat about your work, and it's hard to just go and relax and hide away after you have your presentation when you want to network and engage with others. So since then, I've continued, as Jodie mentioned, I've given a lot of presentations over time, both teaching and conference presentations, and I do still find it quite a stressful thing to do, but I've begun to learn to enjoy it. It really is an amazing opportunity to be able to share ideas, teach others, and actually speak to other people about what you're doing. So I kind of recognize this when I approach my presentations, that you're all taking time to hear me and what I have to say. So it's important that I think about what would be useful to you and think about what messages you should take from all of this. So we're all now a bit more familiar with moving to a virtual world and sort of the opportunities this has provided, as well as some of the disadvantages. So, since COVID, I mean, I'm based in Melbourne, so we were in many, many lockdowns. So we had to quickly pivot to having online meetings, online presentations, online teaching. And, we've kind of continued in this mode. Now, I think it was a really good thing in many ways that we've moved to this world, because it's enabled us to more easily engage with others. Certainly from the Statistical Society of Australia perspective, I'm now much more able to attend other branch events because now things are going online. But it has led to these big challenges in terms of ensuring that we are engaging appropriately with one another and offering opportunities to network, and also, clearly getting our messages across in presentations when it's so difficult to connect. So I think I sort of naively, I guess, believed in the last couple of years that we would move to a world where we're no longer doing this kind of format of presentations. But actually, to say, I think it's really good that we continue to meet in a virtual environment. And I think it's very good as well that we have these mixed mode events, because in terms of equity and access to events, it's ensuring that we've got more diversity in who can join in. But moving from this even online environment that I was starting to get used to this mixed mode hybrid format has made things even more challenging. And it's really important we think about what the particular challenges we have are, so that we make sure we're engaging with the different audiences that we'll be meeting. So the big challenge with these mixed mode or hybrid events is that, of course, some presenters may be online, some might be in person, some of your audience members may be online, some of your audience members may be in person. So the big question I have when I'm approaching an event like that is, how do we ensure that all presenters and audience members feel involved and have a good experience in this kind of an event? Now, I'm very conscious while delivering this presentation to you all that I actually probably should have tried to deliver it mixed mode, so that I was practicing what I was preaching, because I actually do think in this format it's much easier than in the mixed mode format. But still, hopefully, as I say, you'll get some tips from me on how to approach it in the mixed mode format. So what I'm going to do in this presentation, because of the different ways people will be presenting and thinking about, the early career conference, I want to start by talking about tips for those of you that will be presenting entirely online, as I am just now. And the reason I'm starting with that is because it actually is a lot easier than in the mixed mode events. But some of the things that I will mention for the online presenters will be translatable to those delivering in mixed mode. And then I'll finish up with some questions about the mixed mode format. So one of the biggest challenges I had presenting online was this lack of audience, really. As I mentioned, for one thing, with this accent and being based in Australia, when I'm looking at the audience, can tell if you're not understanding me. Another thing is I often present as a statistician to non-statisticians, and it can be really hard now when I'm in that format to understand if I've pitched my message appropriately, because I can't really gauge people's reaction. So that makes the online environment really tricky. And so what I try and do at the start of an online event is make sure people are aware that if they're struggling to understand me, they let me know. So as I mentioned at the start of this presentation, if you were struggling with my accent, it's good if you send a message, and I'll maybe slow down if I can, or enunciate a little bit more. But as I say, the idea of changing my messaging is a little bit trickier when I can't see your reaction. And even those of you that maybe have your camera on, you may potentially be looking at yourself, which means you might be masking your reaction to my presentation, which means I don't know if you are following what I'm saying. Another huge issue that I find very challenging in the online space is engaging with the audience. I've mentioned that one thing is you understanding me, but I'm looking at a lot of just names, to be honest, when I'm giving these kind of presentations. And so it's hard to keep your enthusiasm level up when you're presenting in this format. But you do have to remember as the presenter that you have an audience there and that you're trying to engage them. Because it's understandable that people may turn their cameras off. Of course, it may be bandwidth issues. It may not just be people wanting the privacy or to be able to hide. So you still have to make sure that you're aware that you have all of these audience members out there. Another important thing for those of you that are going to be presenting online is ensuring that you don't have distractions. Now, this was really challenging working from home. Like this poor person watching things on screen, I also have cats. So when I was presenting at home, I was trying to make sure I was in a space where the cats weren't and they wouldn't come in and distract me or start wanting food. At the moment, I'm presenting in my office, so I put a sign on my door saying that I'm presenting, because what I don't want is someone coming in while I'm delivering my presentation to distract me and also distract all of you. So I think thinking ahead and planning and making sure you can avoid distractions as much as possible can help you make sure you stay focused during your presentation. Another issue I have is in elaborating. Now bear with me on this one, because some of you will be much more technically literate than I am, but maybe it's just I can't draw very well in online environments. But when I'm in meetings with people in person, or if I'm at a conference, I want to elaborate on something, I might use a whiteboard, or I might use a pen and paper. Now, one thing I really struggle with though is any of these technologies, like trying to use like a whiteboard on Zoom or anything, it does not help me. It doesn't work for me. It actually adds to my stress level because my drawing in this format is just absolutely terrible. I encourage you to watch this YouTube video actually of someone trying to do one of these drawing things, because yeah, it's completely hopeless, and it shows exactly what I'm like. And so I think the other thing is thinking about your own skill set and what you're comfortable with. Now, I know I'm crap at this, so I'm not going to do it. At no point I'm going to try and draw for you all. But what I do instead is think about what I can prepare in advance. So if I have visuals that I want to show you that I think might illustrate my point, I'll prepare them in advance, and that helps me. As I say, some of you might be much happier using the online kind of whiteboard, but for me, it's not my thing, and that's absolutely fine. But just, appreciate your own strengths and don't push yourself into something that will end up inevitably perhaps distracting you or making you feel more anxious. So just some key tips I have for engaging with the audience when I'm presenting online. And again, as you gathered at the start of the presentation, I asked some of you, and some of you nicely have, kept your videos on so that I feel like I have an audience, because that really helps me. It's also good to have opportunities for interaction where possible. Now, I know for those of you that are maybe giving a 5-minute presentation at the Early Career Conference, that is not necessarily going to be an option for you, but I'm thinking more broadly to those of you in general presentation settings online. Give a moment for people to engage with you, because that helps you remember you've got an audience, and it also helps your audience to feel more part of the presentation. It's also good to encourage questions, but importantly, where you can, have someone else monitor the written questions. So in the background, I'm relying on Jodie here to tell me if any of you have flagged anything that, like, my slides aren't working, I'd say, or you can't hear me, because of course it's quite hard to deliver your presentation, but also to be mindful of monitoring people's questions if they're not just in a room with you sticking their hand up. So this one's a controversial one. I've presented something like this before, and people don't necessarily agree with me on this, but I find it helpful. So although some people really prefer to turn off their own video when they're presenting to avoid distraction, or because they don't actually want to see themselves, I get it. No one really wants to sit and look at a mirror all day or for an hour. I have to admit that I like to keep my own video on when I present. Now, it's not a vanity thing, it's more just about setup and enthusiasm, and also just making sure I can always be seen. What I really hate in presentations I've attended is where suddenly someone's like, it's just their chin that you're seeing or something. So I like to make sure that I'm seated in a good position, that my posture is good and remains good, because that's the thing. I could set it up and look at my posture and think that's fine, and then as the presentation goes, I'll start slumping. It's also good for me to check that I'm smiling and engaged, because if I think that I'm engaged with me presenting, then hopefully you'll all be engaged with me. Another thing, of course, it's good to check that my background isn't too distracting, which hopefully isn't for you. I'm conscious I've got one of these annoying ceiling lights here, but generally speaking, there's nothing in my background that should distract you too much from my slides or from me. Now, for those of you that don't want to look at yourself, completely understand. It is a really weird thing to have to do in a presentation. But I would encourage you, at least in the setup, to go through the motions, turn your own camera on, check your positioning, think about your posture. And also, as I say, as you're going, just trying to be mindful about how much you're smiling during your presentation. Because of course, if you were presenting live in a room to me, you wouldn't be seeing yourself. So you would be trying to engage and smile as much as possible. Another tip I've heard from other people that don't like having their own camera on is maybe making sure that one of the images of someone that is on screen is featured up near their camera, or maybe putting a photo next to the camera or something to make sure that you're looking in the place that you should be looking, to ensure that you're engaging as much as you can in this kind of weird setting. So with that in mind, as I say, the key thing I'm trying to get across here is that it's really important to present to the camera. So while it's normal, even if I was presenting live to you, I'd be looking in different places. I'm not constantly going to fixate and stare at the camera here, but if I look at the screen while I'm talking, it means that I am engaging with you. If I'm looking at my camera, if I look at my screen, I'm just presenting to my slides, then that will distract you as well. It's not like I'm presenting, it's like I'm reading out my slides to you. So it's always good to prepare enough that you feel comfortable to be presenting as you would in a normal setting in person. And with that in mind, I do recommend that you don't simply read off your slides. Now, of course, I can see my slides. I got prompts there, but just as in person, you wouldn't want to be turned completely away from your audience and reading your slides that are shown above. You don't want to just be reading your slides here or reading your notes. Now, I think the online environment has made it a bit easier for us in terms of delivering presentations because we can glance at notes without it being too distracting for people. But it's really important to not get caught in the trap of over-relying on your notes. It can be really off-putting, and it also can prevent you from being particularly engaging with your audience in this type of environment. So I'll just stop now before I get on to some other things about presenting in the online environment that I find kind of challenging. Has anyone got any questions for me at this point before I talk about some of the issues with the technology? Okay. Don't think there's any burning questions. I don't think there's anything in, is there anything in the chat? Nope. Great. So I'll move on and talk a bit about the issues with the technology. Now, this is something I have to say that fills me with more fear than the presenting more generally. As you could probably tell from my discussion about using online whiteboards and whatnot, I just don't really like having to think about technology. I can use technology, but don't want to think about it and don't want it to be an issue while I'm presenting. So what I typically do when I go to a conference in person is I really rely on the organisers to deal with the tech. I don't want to think about it at all. I want to have created my presentation, and I want the only thing I have to worry about is making sure I have rehearsed as much as possible so that my presentation is clear. The problem is when you're presenting on the online environment is that you are the tech person, and that makes things a little bit more stressful. One of the things that I find really frustrating when you're presenting or speaking in an online meeting is this thing at the start where everyone's just like, can you hear me? Can you hear me? Can you see me okay? What's going on there? You've disappeared now, your sound's gone out. And obviously, these things happen, and it is important to acknowledge if people can't hear you, just as obviously in Muscan we had some technical issues at the start. But what we don't want is to have every single presentation, someone spending the first, minute or 2 minutes of what might only be a 5-minute talk, having these difficulties going, can everyone hear me? So it's important that you prepare and make sure you can be heard. So my tips regarding the technology are to definitely attend the practice session put on by the conference organisers. Now, I have to admit that I was one of these people that didn't really like to do practice things because I always thought, I'll do it on the day. I like to be live. I like to just go with it. But in this kind of environment, it's so important because it's not just about your presentation, it's about the technology. So attend the practice session, make sure you are familiar with how you're going to share your slides, what technology is being used. And if the conference organisers haven't put on a practice session, which some may not, attend as early as possible. Like today, Jodie had organised for me to turn up 15 minutes before this session just to check that my slides could be shared and that everything was working. That helped me calm me down because, I feel a little bit out of control when I'm dependent on technology. If there isn't a practice session and if you're getting worried about it, then certainly ask for one. There's no harm in asking the conference organiser, or organise one yourself with your team, your supervisor, your boss, and test out, the equipment that you're going to use that day. So make sure when you're practicing you use the same setup, so your computer, your camera, even the internet connection that we'll be using on the day, because that will help make you more comfortable with things from your side. Certainly there'll be things that might not go according to plan because of things at the organisation side, but this should help you, as I say, make sure that you're as comfortable as you can be. But even if you've had this practice session, sometimes it's not on the day. So make sure you test your settings on the day. Even before I jumped on to meet Jodie, I tested my microphone. I turned on my camera. I made sure that I knew, even before I went to the practice session, what Jodie was going to see, because that made me feel that I was ready to go. As I say, particularly with the sound, I think that can be very problematic, because I think the video can go wrong sometimes, but if your slides can be seen and you can be heard, you can still kind of muddle through. But it is good where possible, as I say, to remember you're giving a presentation. So if you can keep your video on as well, you ideally want to do that. Another challenge is making sure you can be seen and you're seen the way you want to be seen. So as I say, I don't perhaps have most ideal light setting here. I kind of possibly should have turned that light off. But I have been to some online presentations where the person has been quite scary. So apologies to Adrian, I have used this slide before, but Adrian attended an event I organised in 2020, and it was an evening panel session. And yeah, he looked quite terrifying throughout the whole thing, because he had this spotlight in his face. Now, that can be quite distracting. Ideally, we don't want to have lighting that will distract you from the presentation. So that's another thing you can check when testing your settings. I already mentioned this briefly when I was talking about being seen and looking at the camera, but you know, it's important when you're thinking about your camera setup that you are close to the camera so you can be seen. I don't want to present to you like this. This is also incredibly distracting. Similarly, I don't want to be too far away from you. So even though it doesn't matter because I've got a headset on for you hearing me, it still can be off-putting if you're not framed the way you want to be framed for the presentation. So this is one of my biggest fears, and it has happened to me in online presentations, but this whole your internet failing, that's a problem. So think about backups, or think about ways that you can ensure your internet is as strong as possible. So, you know, my personal approach is to make sure my mobile phone is always nearby, because I can easily jump on to the hotspot on my mobile phone so that I can continue my presentation easily. Of course, it'll be distracting. Of course, it'll fill you with nerves. But still, if you've got a backup, you'll feel a bit more confident in case something goes on the day. Because you want to share your work. You want to still be able to deliver your presentation. So think about, you know, if you're at home and your home internet connection isn't great, maybe you do want to be in work. So think about where is best for you to be most confident that your presentation will go the way you want it to. With that in mind, it's really important to think about, particularly if you're, you know, at home and you have housemates or family around also using the technology. This was obviously particularly problematic for those of us in Melbourne in 2020 and 2021 during lockdowns, having things going on in the background that might take up bandwidth. So I highlight this slide because this is actually my partner, and during 2020, 2021, he decided to become an actor and participate in Zoom theatre productions, which was all great and all, but it meant that if ever he was doing a Zoom theatre production, I had to make sure that I wasn't also coordinating meetings or seminars or events at that time, because our internet just wouldn't cope with both of us. And this was going out live in the US, the UK, whatever. So I didn't want him to suddenly not be seen while acting because I was competing with the bandwidth for him. The other thing that I am mindful of is when I'm on my home internet connection and I'm delivering Zoom presentations, if I've connected to like the VPN for work or whatever, that's often slows things down. So I make sure that I don't have that on while I'm going to present, because I want to be as clear as possible and for my slides to be as clear as possible. And as I say, to avoid anything that will maybe make me buffer or my sound to go wonky. And as I say, with that in mind, also make sure other people know that you're giving a presentation. As I say, I put a sign on my door here, but it might be you'll have to, you know, make family members aware, housemates aware, friends aware, to just keep away from you. And also, you know, maybe put your mobile phone on silent and the other things that might distract you because you're presenting in an online space. Another thing in terms of managing the technology, it's really good to send the slides in advance where you can. And this has been helpful for me in the past, because I have been in positions where I couldn't actually get on Zoom easily, but I could phone in and I could actually present the audio, but someone else could skip through my slides. Again, not ideal, not what you want, but it's still better than nothing. And, you know, I knew what was in my slides, so I was happy if they were going to flick through them. But yeah, if you have that option, it's always good to send it in advance. The final thing I want to talk about for those presenting online, which I find a big challenge, and hopefully I'm not alone in this, maybe this is something some of you have found too, is that I often feel deflated after an online presentation. I find it very, very tiring, but I find it very hard because I don't necessarily have feedback. So I think the thing that we underestimate when we're giving a presentation in this format is that it actually does require even more energy, I personally find, than an in-person presentation, because I feel like I'm in some ways putting on this big act. And as I say, at the moment, I am presenting to some of you. I can see some of your faces, but I am presenting to myself too. And so it can be really, really tiring to make sure I keep the energy levels up so that this is an engaging presentation, given that I know there's so many things right now that are going to be competing for your attention with me on, because you can easily go and look at another screen or look at something without me knowing. So it can be really, really tiring. As I mentioned about engaging the audience, the challenge is the difficulty in knowing how you're performing. It's hard for me to know how well this is going, and I can't feed off of your energy, as I say, or get feedback from you all. So one of my tips from that perspective, other than, as I say, trying to encourage people to keep a camera on, it can be nice if you know that there's going to be someone you know in the audience and ask them specifically to keep their camera on, because especially those of you that don't necessarily want to talk to yourself, it means that you could put a friendly face up for you and speak to that friendly face, speak to that friend or colleague, and that'll help you feel more comfortable. And you know what it's like when you're presenting in person. You'll often pick the one or two people at the front of the audience that are smiling encouragingly, or they're nodding their heads like they understand. If you've got a friend that will do that for you in this space, then that'll make things a lot easier for you. And also, you can then hopefully get more direct feedback too after your presentation, because you can get feedback from your colleague or friend who is there. Another tip, which you may or may not want to do, it's similarly controversial, like the turning your camera on and looking at yourself. If you can record your presentation, I think the problem is, and it's very normal for all of us during presentations, whether online or in person, we can become really fixated on the things that didn't work in our presentation, the things that we didn't like about what we said. And if you've got an audience to feed off of, or friends there in person, or people giving you feedback afterwards, you might forget about that a little bit more. But if you're in the room on your own after you've presented online, that might be the only thing that's going round and round and round your head, and you'll forget all of the good things that you've done. So if you have recorded your presentation, it'll help you to see the things you did well and have some pride in the work and your presentation. But it will also help you see if you're making mistakes or things that you wish you'd done better. And you know, if you can look at it and reflect on it, but be kind to yourself, I think you'll be able to see both the good and the bad things. And so you can learn from improvement, but also, as I say, not hopefully fixate on the one or two things that didn't work so well. Another thing I sometimes do is write down or screenshot the nice feedback that I get on my presentations online, because, you know, again, no one's going to talk to me directly afterwards necessarily, so that can help me when I'm feeling a bit deflated afterwards, or when planning my next presentation, to help me think about what things I do well when I'm presenting in this type of environment. The other thing is, of course, as I mentioned, I find it really tiring presenting irrespective of the type of presentation, but I do find particularly staring at my screen really tiring. So it's hard when you're presenting during a conference, but if you can, make sure you give yourself some downtime after a virtual presentation. Take a break from the screen in particular, read a book, go for a walk, distract yourself, but you know, do something to make you feel a little bit better after you've been G'ing up and providing a lot of energy for something that, as I say, is still, even these days, quite an artificial presentation setting. So to finish this first part, presenting online, as I say, can be tricky, but hopefully through these steps that I've provided, through these tips, it'll help you to make sure you feel a bit more confident, even, you know, with the technology side of things, and also feel a bit more comfortable in your approach to trying engaging with your audience. So say I always try when I'm doing these presentations to be as animated as I am in person, but I do have to be careful that I don't get too excited and speak too quickly. But the key to a good presentation, irrespective of the mode, is to remember to enjoy yourself, and enjoy presenting and sharing your ideas to people. Now, before I move on to the final few slides about presenting at a mixed mode event, has anyone got any questions particularly about what I've covered so far in the online environment? So feel free to type them in or turn on your microphone if anyone has anything they want to ask. Really, I'm just giving myself the opportunity to take some water. Sue, you've got a question.
Hi.
Hi, Sue.
I just had a question. I've done a couple of online presentations, and the issue that I have is that I cannot actually see myself. It just becomes my slides.
Yes. Yeah,
and then
I
find out afterwards, like I've been to the side the whole time and nobody told me.
Yeah.
So I don't really know. I've actually tried to figure it out, how to see myself, but I actually still haven't figured it out. And I don't know if you have any tips about, what to do if you're just in a foreign environment or using somebody else's computer, or how you deal with that when you can't really see yourself at all when you're presenting online.
That's a really good point, because I think not all presentations are necessarily Zoom or Teams or anything like that. And sometimes, the audience can't interact with you in an online presentation because it's deliberately designed so that you're just a talking head and it's just you in the chair. But I think for me, trying to be aware of where the camera is on the device that I'm using, and as I say, that's difficult if you're using someone else's, but even then, again, if you've got a chance to go and look at it before you jump into the event, I would. Also, ideally, the chair or whoever is assisting your event should advise you and help you. So I would certainly ask to see what the audience will see before I start, because as I say, I find it easier when I can see some audience members, but I do find it easier when I can see myself, because then I know what you all can see. But you're absolutely right. If they don't tell you about the setup, it can make it tricky. But I would just make sure it's clear. Managing expectations is part of this too. Make it clear to the organizer that you want the time to know what everyone will see, not just your slides, but also you. Because in that setting, Sue, you might as well have had your camera off, really, if it was more. Because in some settings, people do just talk to slides and are just speaking over them, but it still is better if you are there to present as well as have your slides, because I think that is the most engaging for the audience. Thanks, Sue. Any other questions before I move on?
Oh, Karen, it's Peter. So I am not on video because I'm in the car.
All good, all good.
One of the benefits of virtual. When you present, do you have both the presenter's notes and the presentation up? Because I find that often means that you can't see everyone on Zoom when you've got the two screens, like one with your presentation up and one with the notes up that PowerPoint allows you to do.
Yep, you're right. So at the moment I have 3 screens on, and that was another setting I was testing with Jodie because I kept sharing the wrong screen. So that is a really tricky thing when you're presenting online, is you might not be showing people things in presenter mode. But at the moment, where I'm looking, if this will help you, Peter, is that I am looking at my notes to myself, so that kind of format, and all the way over on my screen on the right is where what you can see is. So I can still look at my notes and you and see my slides too, because that's the format I've got set up. But what I have, to be honest, because typically I don't use my notes too much anyway. I do like this open so that I can see what slide's coming next. But actually, because I'm aware of what's coming up in this presentation, I have more of this computer screen, more of you than I have my own slides. So I actually can see. I make it so I've got about 4 or 5 of you up at the moment, So that I do have a few faces, people that put their camera on. But for me personally, that's what helps me. I want to see more of the audience. But depending, as I say, a lot of this is personal choice. Just as, presentations, people have their own personal style. But I prefer to see more audience than my own slides, and occasionally glance at my slides than I prefer to see my notes. So, but where possible, I try and have what the audience sees somewhere else from what I'm seeing with my notes, if that helps.
Yep, thanks. Yeah, that's just trying to set it up right, I guess, before we start.
Yeah, exactly. So I made sure that I had gallery view on for my Zoom, not presenter view, because I didn't want to just look at myself. And then I just expanded it to have a few of you on screen so that I know that I have an audience.
Yep. Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Okay, so I'll move on to the next bit, which, as I say, is actually harder than the presenting online, I think. And I think it's something that we still need to get a lot better at. I'm sure many of you have been to mixed mode events where either as the in-person audience member or presenter, where it's difficult to make sure you're engaging with online, or vice versa. I think we're still in a bit of a transition point where it's quite hard to appropriately engage with both audience types, but it's becoming more and more important. As I mentioned, I think it's a very good thing. I think it's important for accessibility and inclusivity, but we are more and more having these events that are a mixture of in-person and online. And I think even with the Early Career Conference, you've got this added challenge where you've got these different hubs of in-person. So even you've got in-person groups going across to other in-person groups that are virtually meeting. So as I say, it gives all these excellent opportunities, but it does make engaging with the audience even more challenging. So I am no expert in this. I want to flag this. I just want to highlight some things that I think about when I'm presenting at mixed mode events or thinking about mixed mode events, to try and help you to be as engaging as you can be. Because one of the big problems, if you're presenting in person, but there's an online audience, is that you might only engage with the in-person audience. And that is completely natural, and I'm not judging people for doing that. I certainly have done this myself. But we have to be more and more mindful these days that will alienate a whole fraction of your audience. And if you're doing that and you're only engaging with the in-person audience, then you are not really ensuring a mixed mode event can be successful. Now, one thing I have to mention is that it is not all on you, of course, though. One of the challenges I think we have with these mixed mode or hybrid events is that it can depend on the setup of the room, which you don't have much control over. Certainly last week I was chairing a hybrid event and I wasn't very comfortable with the camera and in-person setup. It just didn't work quite well to engage with the online audience, and that was problematic. I should have given myself more time in advance to think about it, because I think in retrospect what I should have done was ask if we just could use the laptop camera for our presenter, because then the online audience would have felt that they were getting things directed at them, because of course as part of the looking at your audience you would occasionally look at your computer. So I think reflecting on things that go well and things that don't go so well, I think sometimes rooms are not equipped in the way that we need them to be for a successful mixed mode event. But as I say, there are some things you can do as a presenter to engage with both audiences. So just as I mentioned before with the online ones, that it's really useful to turn up early to your presentation. Same goes when you're going to present in person, because it enables you the opportunity to see the room set up, familiarise yourself with the technology. We're not in a position now where we're just going to be flicking through our slides here. We want to make sure we know what the room is like and where the camera is relative to where your computer setup is and what people are going to be seeing. So there's a few things that I want to cover in terms of engaging the audience. And of course, one of the key things, just as you have with the online environment, is thinking about where you have to look when you're in a hybrid event. As I say, it could be, it's completely natural to look at your in-person audience, but think about the camera as another audience member. And that is key for making it a success, because if you are aware and acknowledge that there are other people looking at you from that perspective, then that will be something else you can glance at. Now, not, fixate on it and not only look at that camera, because then you're going to alienate your in-person audience. But just as, you'll cast your eyes around people, just make sure that's one of your people, I guess, would be my best recommendation. So make sure you get to the room early enough so that you know where the camera is. And hopefully it's in a good position so that you can actually easily look at it from time to time while you're looking at other audience members. And as I say, if it isn't a setup where you think it's a bit strange, ask if there's an option to use a camera on the laptop or another setting if you think that would be better. Because again, conference organisers are learning too about what's the best way to do the mixed mode engagement. And a lot of it feels like, okay, well, we've got everyone together, that's it. But actually, there's a little bit more we can think about to be as engaging as possible. So the next thing, of course, that you can do when you're familiarising yourself with the room setup is also think about where you can be heard. Because, again, you might be placed at a lectern, but I don't know, some of you may be like me, I like to move about when I'm talking. And it might be that as soon as you move away from the lectern, your virtual audience won't be able to hear you. It might be that the microphone is set up so that you have to be at the lectern, and so you have to train yourself that, unfortunately, it's not what is so natural for you as a presenter, but that is what you will need to do to make sure you engage with both audiences. So ask about where the microphone is, ask about what range the virtual attendees can hear. And also an important thing, if you have time, I know again it's hard when you've only got a few minutes in your presentation, but it can be really good at the start of a mixed mode or hybrid event to acknowledge that you have both in-person and virtual attendees. So if you're welcoming people to your event, if you're giving a longer session, say thank you for joining me to both the people in person and online, looking at both audiences when you're welcoming them. And certainly within the first minute or two of your talk, as I say, for a longer talk, make sure that you are looking at both audiences and both have been engaged. Another thing I mentioned, with the online presentations too, that it can be hard to present long periods without getting the interaction. So it can be good to try and have audience interaction. So here, just at a minimum, I've had these pauses to try and get you to ask questions if you had them. But of course, in mixed mode events, you may have a question and think of asking people their thoughts on something. Who agrees with this question? And get yes or no answers. And it's typical to get people to put their hands up. But of course, think about the fact you have both audiences. So what methods of engagement can you use for both if you're in a hybrid event? So ensure that it's an option for both to participate. So online polls might be the best option because both audiences could participate via their mobile phone, for example. The important thing too is if you are using breakout groups and you're in a hybrid event, make sure that both the online and in-person audiences are facilitated. This is something I've also seen not to have done particularly well, in that the in-person people might be more aware of what they're doing to start and be ready to go and work together as a group, but the online people can feel a bit lost and left out the mix. And so making sure that they get instructions, and also if there's reporting back at these hybrid events, that both the online groups and in-person groups can speak. So it's just, engaging everyone equitably. Another thing I'm going to talk about is your final slide. Now, this isn't something just at the mixed mode event. Now, one of the points here is important at your mixed mode event, but one thing that I see more often than not for anyone delivering presentations is their final slide is a big list of references. That is not a good approach for presenting, and we all still do it, and I'm sure I've done it in some of our presentations too, but that's giving your final emphasis on the slide that might be there on the screen the longest to other people and other researchers whose work you're quoting. Make sure you have your key messages on your final slide. I even don't think it's a good idea to have just any questions slide as your final slide. Have your key messages up and ask people if they have any questions, because then your messages are there, can help prompt people to have questions around those, but also that'll be the take-home things that people will go away with. So irrespective of how you're presenting, I would recommend the key messages on your final slide. But importantly, if you're presenting online or mixed mode, make sure you have your contact details on your final slide, so your email address, because that will ensure that your online participants can't come up to you after your presentation and talk to you about your presentation as easily as the in-person people can. But if they were really engaged and want to collaborate with you or want to learn more about your study, that means they can follow up with you because your email address is easy to find at the end of your presentation. The other thing to be mindful of when you're prepping for your presentation, when you go to the room to see what the setup is like, is make sure you know from the event organizer about how questions can be asked before you deliver your presentation. It may be, I have sadly been some events where the online participants can't ask questions live. That's obviously not ideal because we want everyone to have equal engagement. But we want to know, can the online participants turn on their microphone and read out questions, or are they entirely typed in? If they're entirely typed in, whose responsibility is it to monitor it and jump between questions of the in-person audience and the online audience? As I say, ideally you want both to have the option, and you want to rotate and alternate questions between both audiences. But a lot of that is, as I say, on the organizer or the chair, but still yourself being mindful that that you have the two audiences, and ask if you've got questions from the audience online will ensure that as an in-person presenter, you're making your online audience feel engaged. The other thing with questions is that your online participants, of course, if they write your questions, it's important that those questions are read out or communicated to the in-person audience too, so that everyone's equally engaged. But the other thing is that your online participants might not be able to hear questions from your in-person audience. And this is the one where we sometimes don't present so well, in that as the presenter or the person that's chairing, someone should read out the question on the microphone so that the online audience can hear the question too. So as a presenter, it's good to check with the chair or the organizer, do I have to repeat the question when the in-person audience asks it so that the online person can hear? Because the difficulty, I see this quite a lot, where people start answering a question and the online audience is left going, oh, what was the question? And you're trying to work it out from the answer. Now, it does feel unnatural, so don't worry if you've started answering the question and you're getting through it and you go, oh, I should have repeated the question. We all make mistakes. Feel free to stop at that point and say, oh, I forgot to reiterate the question, and then make it clear to the online audience, because, as I say, that makes sure everyone's engaged. So I said I wasn't going to do any general tips, but I guess just some key things, because I know a few people had asked for my thoughts and things that I think about when I'm putting a presentation together, is limiting the number of slides you have. I think at one point someone told me roughly 1 slide per minute or something, but I mean, it all depends on the presenter and how long you're happy to talk to each slide. But what I would do is just make sure your slides are very clear and are not cluttered with a lot of text and too much information. So if that means you're having to split information over 2 slides, by all means do that. Really good to have a nice clear introduction to try and engage people. So I thought I would talk about my own experiences to all of you so that you know why I'm talking to you about presentation. So it can be nice if you're giving a longer presentation to give an anecdote, but just make sure your introduction, you're trying to hook people in. Think about the pace. Obviously, you don't want to power through it too quickly. And I know that can be tricky when you're only given a 5-minute talk. So make sure you think about what are the key messages you want to get across, and don't cover everything in 5 minutes. You can't possibly. Think about using visuals versus text or tables. We often see in statistics we'll produce a lot of tables, but actually think about whether a graph will help illustrate the themes better than a table. And of course, rehearse. So I'm conscious I'm just about out of time, so I'm just going to finish up here. You'll see landing on my key message slide for you all with my contact details. So I just wanted to flag, as I hope I've made clear throughout all this, that presenting is hard, and we're all continuing to develop our skills and learning from the mistakes and things that we could do better. But for me, I think the key thing is to spend time preparing. And in this format, it's not just preparing your slides and rehearsing your talk, but preparing from the technology perspective and thinking about your audience and your microphone and your video settings, those kind of things. That's all part of the preparation. My key thing is engage with your audience or audiences. That's the thing that's the most challenging in this format, is it's just an unnatural way of engagement, but that's got to be at the forefront of your mind when you're delivering this kind of presentation. What's the best way to make sure I keep everyone moving with me? and also finally give the audience the ability to connect with you. So as I mentioned, having contact details means that people can follow up if they aren't able to ask a question or connect with you live. So that's everything from me. I have a couple of minutes left if anyone has some final burning questions. But as I say, I'm very happy if anyone has anything they want to ask for you to follow up with me via email.
So I guess one quick thing, Hannah just had to click off, but she did make a comment. What makes a good audience member that's, what can the audience do to help with the mixed modes?
So the audience, the virtual audience or the in-person audience?
Both.
Both. From the virtual perspective, keeping your camera on when you can, I think really shows that you're actually engaged. It's been really helpful. As I say, not everyone can, I completely understand, but it's been really helpful for a presenter or for me today to see some of you nodding and smiling along, because as I say, that's what I look to when I'm presenting in person. Similarly for an audience in person, help your presenter by nodding, smiling, engaging with them. But the other thing I guess to be mindful of as an in-person audience member is that you do have the virtual audience attendees. So keep your questions concise. If you've got a long comment or something you want that's more of a discussion point that you want to speak to the presenter about, approach them afterwards. I would use the question time as more of a concise question that is easy for the online audience to hear if it has to be repeated, and so it doesn't make it more of an in-person event rather than both in-person and virtual. So the in-person audience has to be mindful of the online audience too.
Thank you. That was great. Does anyone have any other questions for Karen? Well, reading, I just want to thank you, Karen, very much. This was very, very wonderful presentation, and I definitely learned a few things, and will pay attention as I'm setting up for the Early Career Conference.
As I say, when I was putting this together, particularly the second part, I was like, just thinking about all the things that I've done wrong and don't think about. But I think this was actually very good for me because I've presented in the past about speaking online, which, as I say, I think we're all getting a bit better at. But just thinking about some of these things for the mixed mode format can really, really help both organisers and presenters, I think, moving forward.